Leonardo da Vinci, Chapter 6, The Reign of the Prince. Isabella d'Este, the Margravine of Mantua, was famous in her lifetime. She has continued to be remembered not for what she did herself, but because of her circle. There are some people who can't paint particularly well, or write, or play music, or compose it, but who nevertheless love the arts. So they surround themselves with persons who can do one or another of these things very well indeed. Isabella's special talent was to surround herself with such people. Her rank was not very high. Her sister Beatrice as a duchess had been much grander. Nor was she rich. She and her husband, Francesco Gonzaga, had a hard time keeping up appearances to match their title, so she couldn't tempt famous men with promises of fortune. She could not be a patron on the scale of Lorenzo de' Medici or Lodovico Forza, her brother-in-law. Nevertheless, she did very well at collecting art and artists. In fact, she did better than a lot of wealthy patrons. This was because she tried hard and kept working at it. Isabella d'Este took pride in owning a few exquisite pictures and the best statues money could buy. Not many, but one or two. She believed she knew a good deal about painting, sculpture, and building. It was not beyond her to tell her artist guests exactly how they ought to go about their work. Most of them meekly took it. She encouraged promising young poets, and they wrote songs glorifying Isabella d'Este and told her that her own poems were wonderful. More than others of the nobility, she appreciated Leonardo's talents and was proud of knowing him. She considered him a friend and not just a painter. When he consented in his offhand way to come to stay at Mantua after he left Milan, she was delighted. At the back of her mind was the hope that she could persuade him to paint a portrait of herself. Isabella never had any scruples about getting what she wanted in the way of pictures. She had one little trick especially. She would pay a poor artist a small sum in advance, acting as if it were really just a gift to help him along. Then, when she was sure he had spent it, she would begin to remind him that he owed her some work. Politely, she would keep reminding and reminding him until the most dilatory painter would in desperation give her what she was after. Anyone would, that is, except Leonardo. Here the determined woman met her match. You could go on bothering Leonardo forever and ever, but if he happened to be interested in something other than painting, as he usually was, he would not do your picture, and Isabella found this out. It was not that Leonardo meant to be ungenerous or tantalizing. He probably had every intention of doing as she wished at first. He went so far as to make the preliminary sketch of Isabella. She would have been happy to have had that, at least, though it wasn't flattering in the way ladies of the time were used to having their portraits painted. It made her look handsome, as indeed she was, but it also looked rather hard and cold. Her husband hated the picture, just as husbands today sometimes hate photographs of their wives, which they think don't do justice to the subject. One day when Isabella was not looking, long after Leonardo had given up the project and gone to Venice, Francesco gave away her copy of the sketch. So poor Isabella got nothing after all. She kept on writing to Leonardo and sending him messages and begging for some painting, any painting, the smallest possible painting. But he never let her have one. In spite of everything, he really didn't seem to like Isabella d'Este. From Mantua, Leonardo went to Venice, the lovely city with canals instead of streets flowing between lacy palaces. Leonardo had a good reason for going to this wealthy city, over and above the fact that he had never seen it before. One of the things that was becoming stronger in his nature was the desire to achieve something with his knowledge of science. It is not very odd that this genius of a painter should have thought his painting comparatively unimportant. He was much more interested in his studies of physics and chemistry and physiology. Many people are like that, especially those who are always trying to learn more, like Leonardo. The thing they know they can do well is not so interesting to them as the thing they have not yet mastered. That is why Leonardo painted only when he was driven to do it by financial needs. Once in a long while, when he was embarked on a painting like The Last Supper that needed a lot of thought and planning, he would be absorbed in it. But it was rather difficult to get him so caught up in a picture that he would finish it as he did that one. And at this time, Leonardo wanted above all to put some of his engineering theories into practice. It was the turn of the century, the year 1500. Venice found herself in danger from the Turks. They had advanced much farther than anyone in Italy had ever expected. They had even come across the Mediterranean and fought on Italian soil. The Venetians were in a panic. Leonardo is said to have arrived with an introduction from the French noble Count de Ligny. The Count was ruling Milan as Louis's viceroy. Leonardo prized this introduction more than anything because it presented him as a military engineer, not merely a painter of holy scenes. Everybody was in such a state of nerves that the newcomer got right to work with his plans for defense. He saw that the river Isonzo could of itself serve as a barrier to the invaders. This was important because the Venetians thought they would not have time to build regular fortresses before the Turks arrived. A few men with the aid of such a river are equivalent to a large number, said Leonardo. He planned sluices to drain off the city's water highways in case they flooded. When the authorities complained that it would cost too much, he reminded them that they often spent far more than he needed on unnecessary wars with practically half of Europe, the Empire, the Church, the King of Spain, and the King of France. After that, he had no more of such complaints. He also made guns for the Venetians, but most interesting of his preparations for defense was a new invention he thought up. This was to get under the enemy's ships whenever they should approach the city, and bore holes in the bottoms. Long ago, he had got the idea of diving suits from watching divers who carried airbags down under water with them. Leonardo took the idea further and invented watertight suits. These had glass over the eyes so that the wearers could look around, and pipes that carried air from the surface. He also thought of a kind of spear with which the diver could defend himself from dangerous fish, and gloves with webbing between the fingers like duck's feet to help him in swimming. It all suggests the skin diving outfits that we see in use today. Leonardo also made up a more elaborate apparatus, a dress with stiff loops to hold off the water's pressure when the diver got in deep. With this, he proposed a mask connected with a great bladder of air. This would be emptied when the diver first got in, carrying weights to take him to the sea bottom. Then it would be refilled underwater from other bladders. All these gadgets were to be kept invisible on the surface of the water, so that the enemy might not see them. Leonardo decided this information should be kept secret. Suddenly he realized that he was actually mixed up in a war. In his notebook he carried a deadly secret that might cause the death of hundreds of people if it got into the wrong hands. For the first time, he seems to have felt twinges of conscience. Until then, the machines he invented for killing men had all been merely so many experiments and theories. Now he had doubts. Nevertheless, like so many scientists since, he felt it was excusable to use these things when you were on the right side, so he went on inventing them. He thought up a ship to sink another ship. This was a little craft covered with iron that was to be propelled underwater close to the enemy ship to sink it. In other words, he invented a submarine. This he kept secret too. What happened to all his inventions remains unknown. History doesn't mention that they were ever used, only that Venice wasn't conquered this time. Was Leonardo bitterly disappointed again, or was he relieved that the engines of destruction were not to be on his conscience? He left nothing about it in his notes. At any rate, he could comfort himself with the thought that at last he had been taken seriously as an engineer. After Venice, Leonardo da Vinci carried out his earlier intention, which had been postponed because of the emergency, and went home to Florence. It was the spring of 1500, 16 years since he had left the city in anger. The men who had been his comrades and fellow pupils in youth were anxious to see if he had changed, now that he was 48. In those days, 48 was quite an age. They observed that he was as strong as ever. Leonardo had always been unusually strong. It was said he could bend a bar of iron with his bare hands. However, he looked much older, though he had not begun to stoop. He wore glasses, his face was somewhat wrinkled, and his hair was thinner. He looked just a little forbidding. He dressed very carefully and rather richly, his friends reported, but he wouldn't go to the extremes demanded by fashion. In his writings, he said scornfully that Florentine fops were wearing clothes so long they had to carry them as ladies carry their trains. Quite sensibly, Leonardo wore his coats only down to the knee. His friends were delighted to have him back in Florence, but his family was not particularly interested. Ser Piero was about 65 or more, and that really was old in the 16th century. After his third wife died, he had married again, and he had 5 children by the fourth wife. By this time, he had lost interest in his eldest son. He and Leonardo were on reasonably friendly terms, but that was as far as it went. The first work Leonardo undertook to do in Florence was another painting, an altarpiece in a monastery. He moved outright to the monastery with Sile. But hardly had he settled down when he was overtaken by his old habit of getting interested in something outside the commissioned work. I say bad habit, because there is no doubt it was very vexing to the poor monks who had commissioned the painting. This time Leonardo's great outside interest was geometry. We cannot really regret that he should have concentrated on geometry, or whatever attracted his brilliant mind. He simply had to go the way his intellect led him, and in fact his studies of geometry did have their effect on his painting. Many of his group paintings were geometrical. The design he finally worked out for the monks in a picture that still exists, the Virgin and St. Anne, forms a perfect triangle. When the preliminary drawing, called a cartoon, was finished, the monks were so amazed and delighted that they forgot all their complaints. Word of this new wonder reached the eager ears of Isabella d'Este, and she sent a friend as messenger to beg Leonardo to remember her portrait. Or if he could not bring himself to do that, she wanted some other painting, a Madonna at least. The messenger wrote to her from Florence that Leonardo seemed to be leading a very unsettled life. He was sick of painting, spent all his time on geometry, and led his assistants to do his painting for him. At last, this man got to Leonardo himself and carried Isabella's pleading message. But Leonardo put him off. He said that whatever he did at the moment would have to go to the King of France, as he owed him first consideration. If he ever had anything extra, Isabella should get it. This was not strictly true. Leonardo had not committed himself to Louis XII. He only kept the king in mind as someone he might one day depend on, but the excuse served to put off Isabella. His next patron was not French at all. Instead, Leonardo found himself working for one of the most interesting and wicked figures of the Renaissance, the notorious Cesare Borgia, a Roman-born Spaniard. Cesare was brought up to be a cardinal, but he hated the limitations of life in the church and left it. From that time on, he plotted and schemed to become the wealthiest and most powerful man in Italy. He was a man so eaten by ambition that no other emotion filled his heart. He had no conscience and no real love or friendship for anyone, though he could assume charm when he liked, and had managed to attract some very pleasant people. Cesare had spent some time at the court of Louis XII. There he had married a French princess. King Louis was very fond of him, and Cesare's wife loved him. Yet it was strongly suspected in Rome that Cesare had murdered his own elder brother out of hatred and jealousy. It was more than suspected. It was known that he never stopped at the murder of other people if they stood in the way of his slightest desire. In a world where selfishness and violence were commonplace, Cesare Borgia's name was so bad that when he was killed, he was buried just where he fell, in unconsecrated ground. And ever since that day, the country people there have sworn that his ghost haunts the neighborhood. Only in our time, in 1954, have his bones been dug up during modern building operations, and at last buried in a nearby churchyard. Cesare Borgia has been remembered and feared for more than 4 centuries. This strange creature was handsome and dashing, and was always dressed with great extravagance. He fascinated a Florentine named Machiavelli to such an extent that Machiavelli wrote a book or treatise about him. This he called The Prince, describing his idea of what a perfect ruler should be. His model for this perfection was the murderous Caesar. The Borgia must have had a lot of personal charm to attract not only the King of France and the secretary and countless others, but also the usually indifferent Leonardo. Caesar wanted Leonardo as one of his court, not so much because he himself was fond of painting, but because he had seen how other important people admired the artist. He tempted Leonardo by asking him to be his architect and military engineer. Leonardo much preferred such work to painting altarpieces for monks, and he accepted willingly. In 1502, when Leonardo joined him, Caesar had embarked on a series of conquests, intending to carve out for himself a kingdom. He had taken the Romagna by force of arms, and the town of Piombino on the west coast of Italy, which was surrounded by marshes. Leonardo went to Piombino and set to work as Caesar had directed him, figuring out a way to drain the marshy country. Though nobody then knew that mosquitoes carry malaria, it had been observed that fever seemed to hang over wet ground. Then Caesar summoned Leonardo to the city of Arezzo, near Florence. A famous mercenary captain, or condottiere, Vitellozzo Vitelli, was encamped there. Arezzo under Vitellozzo was in revolt against Florence on its own account, which is the reason Caesar had allied himself with the mercenary. The fact that they were opposing his own city did not deter Leonardo from helping them with his inventions. Clearly, Leonardo felt no special loyalty to Florence. After all, the governing body, or signoria, was not that under which he had had his training. The Medici family, he knew, had long since been driven out. Most Italians felt loyalty to a ruling family, but the conception of loyalty to a state or nation had not yet entered their heads. When Caesar and Vitellozzo threatened Florence from the outskirts, the Duke of Milan and the King of France sent troops to assist the Florentines. Caesar then turned his attention to a new conquest, the Duchy of Urbino. So Leonardo went to Urbino too, and studied the architecture there. He traveled on wherever Caesar went, and he never mentions having been shocked by the methods with which the adventurer made his gains. He rarely mentions such matters at all, even as a spectator. It was enough for him to wander about as he did, doing what was asked of him, making his sketches and jotting down observations. While all this fighting was going on, whispers began to run through Italy that Caesar could not survive much longer. Everyone was complaining, and the King of France was on his way to Milan to see for himself what was happening in Italy. Surely, said the angry Italians, he would not allow this dangerous mad dog of a fellow to continue to run riot. What they had not counted on was that Caesar was clever enough to appeal to the king's greed. Whenever he was with Louis, he talked of the claim to Naples of the French royal house. Louis insisted that this claim still held good, though Charles VIII had been tricked into abandoning the kingdom after winning it once in Lodovico's day. In the late summer of 1502, Caesar hurried to Milan to meet Louis, and there the eager onlookers were staggered and disappointed to see that his power of fascination still served him well. Louis seemed to think nothing bad could be true of this plausible, good-looking young aristocrat. Dizzy with triumph and more than ever sure of himself, Caesar then gave his military engineer full powers to go ahead with tremendous improvements. In the credentials he bestowed on Leonardo, he called him the most excellent and beloved servant, architect and engineer general Leonardo da Vinci. The engineer could go where he liked without paying passage. He was to have all the workmen he needed and all the help he asked for. It is no wonder Leonardo didn't see fit to criticize the behavior of Caesar. To his knowledge, no one else had ever been given more power to do the sort of thing he had always longed to do. So many plans and glittering pictures occurred to Caesar that it was hard to decide what needed his attention first, but he had an idea. The port of Cesena in Romagna was a vital spot in the development of his new possessions, but it was rapidly silting up and becoming useless. Leonardo suggested that a canal could be built between the city and the port, and he set to work on it immediately, staying a long time at Cesena. While he was happily at work on his canal, the people who had been tricked or driven out of their homes by Cæsar decided to band together. They made war on him in this fashion and had some success immediately. The Duke of Urbino won back his domain, and Caesar's conquered territory kept shrinking until he was in a state of siege at Imola. Now one of his strongest enemies was Vitellozzo, whom he had abandoned. Much as they hated Caesar, the Signoria of Florence were more afraid of Vitellozzo. They must make some sort of compact with Caesar. So they sent their secretary, Machiavelli, to talk matters over with him at Imola. Leonardo, too, was there. The painter stayed on with Caesar through the winter, while the crafty man spun his webs and intrigues, and at last succeeded in persuading Vitellozzo to make friends with him again. It was extraordinary how such a wicked man managed over and over to fool people who should have known better. Before he came to an end of all his crimes, Caesar committed a dreadful one there at Imola. He invited to a great banquet Vitellozzo and another mercenary with whom he was now supposed to be on the best of terms. They came, and Caesar promptly led them away from their soldiers into a back room where they were assassinated. Not long afterwards, Caesar met his death. But before that, Leonardo had left Imola, and the strange court of Caesar Borgia broke up. In January 1503, the painter returned to Florence. No one held it against him that he had been working for Caesar. Calm as ever, untouched by the violence and bloody crimes that had gone on around him, Leonardo continued in his studies. He was now passionately interested in discovering the secret of flying.